The encounter that changed everything. The trade station floated silently in the vast emptiness of the cosmos, a beacon of intergalactic cooperation. Aliens of countless species wandered the corridors, their languages, colors, and forms blending into a symphony of diversity. Among them, humans were a rarity, a species whispered about more than encountered. Krina, a Zixern scholar, adjusted her translator device as she entered a dimly lit bar. Her research focused on understanding war across species, a topic humans dominated in galactic archives. She hoped to find one of the few humans stationed here, but instead, she encountered Sorg, a veteran of the Gurax fleet. His compound eyes glimmered in the low light, and his antennae twitched as she approached. "I heard you fought humans," Krina said cautiously, sitting across from him. Sorg's mandibles clicked in amusement. "Fought?" he repeated, swirling his drink. "No, I survived them." "There's a difference." Intrigued, Krina leaned forward. "What made them so dangerous?" "Surely, advanced technology or numbers." Sorg laughed, a chittering, humorless sound. "Not technology. Not numbers. It's their minds. Humans don't just fight wars, they rewrite the rules." The veteran began his tale, voice tinged with a mix of awe and fear. "Our first encounter with humans was during the Great Expansion. We were an unstoppable force, conquering planets with ease. Then came the Terrans. At first, they seemed underwhelming: primitive technology, a chaotic political structure, and no centralized military force. But when we attacked their outer colonies, we learned what made them different." He paused, savoring the weight of his words. "They adapt." Krina tilted her head. "Adapt? All species adapt. Not like them." Sorg gestured widely. "We bombarded their outposts, expecting them to crumble. Instead, they built underground bunkers within days. When we disrupted their communications, they reverted to ancient methods: couriers, coded signals, even messages etched on metal plates. It was infuriating. No matter what advantage we had, they countered it with some improvisation." The scholar's antennae twitched thoughtfully. "But improvisation only goes so far." "Not for humans," Sorg countered. "They turned a losing battle into an art form. I remember our fleet cornered their ships near the binary rift. Superior firepower, positioning, we had them. Then, they did something insane." "What?" Krina asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They scuttled half their fleet," Sorg said, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "Self-destructed their own ships to create a debris field. We couldn't maneuver without risking damage. And while we were stuck, they launched boarding parties, on jetpacks. No shields, no advanced tech. Just raw, desperate courage." Krina's eyes widened. "Jetpacks? That's suicide." "Exactly," Sorg agreed, his tone heavy. "But to them, it wasn't madness, it was strategy. They use everything: technology, instincts, even fear. And they win because they don't play by the rules." The scholar's mind raced. This was unlike anything she had studied before. "So, they won because they were unpredictable?" "They won," Sorg corrected, "because they're relentless. And if you think that's terrifying, you haven't seen their true strength yet. The battlefield of the mind." The bar's quiet murmur seemed to amplify as Sorg continued his tale, his voice tinged with both awe and bitterness. Krina couldn't look away. The grizzled veteran's words painted a picture more vivid than anything she had read in historical archives. "You see, humans don't just fight with weapons," Sorg began. "They fight with their minds, their creativity. Take the Battle of Zirian Abyss. Our fleet outnumbered theirs 5-1, armed with superior energy weapons and state-of-the-art shielding. By all logic, they should have been obliterated. What happened?" Krina asked, her voice low, almost reverent. They used their own weakness as bait, Sorg said, his mandibles twitching. Their fleet's energy reserves were depleted, leaving their shields vulnerable. Instead of retreating, they faked a massive failure. Disabled all non-essential systems, letting their ships drift like wounded animals. We thought we had them. We moved in for the kill. Krina leaned forward. And? They detonated their fuel reserves, Sorg said with a dry laugh. The explosion wasn't powerful enough to destroy our ships, but it was enough to scramble our sensors. In the chaos, their smaller vessels darted in like predators, firing kinetic projectiles at point-blank range. It was barbaric. Yet brilliant. Primitive weaponry defeating advanced technology, Krina mused, her antennae twitching thoughtfully. How is that possible? Humans don't care about elegance, Sorg said, his voice filled with bitter admiration. They care about results. While we were perfecting plasma cannons and precision targeting, they were refining explosives, projectile weapons, and psychological warfare. Psychological warfare? Krina echoed, tilting her head. Sorg's compound eyes narrowed. They weaponized fear. Rumors spread through our ranks like wildfire, stories of humans who could see in the dark, who fought even when mortally wounded. They spread these tales intentionally, planting fear in our minds before we even faced them. And then, during the siege of Talon Prime. He trailed off, his gaze distant. What happened at Talon Prime? Krina prompted gently. They used sound, Sorg said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Low-frequency waves that resonated through our hulls, making us feel as if the ships themselves were groaning under immense pressure. And then came the screams, artificial, of course, but they were designed to mimic the death cries of our species. It broke us. Entire battalions surrendered without a single shot fired. Krina shuddered. That's monstrous. Effective, Sorg corrected sharply. Humans don't think like us. To them, war isn't just about killing, it's about breaking the enemy's will to fight. And once they've done that, they build you back up. Krina frowned, confused. Build you back up? Sorg nodded. After the war, they didn't annihilate us. They offered trade, cooperation. They sent aid to our devastated worlds. It's almost as if they see war as a necessary evil, a way to earn respect and forge alliances. But make no mistake, they don't forget, and they don't forgive easily. Krina sat back, processing his words. They fight to survive, but they also fight to connect? In a twisted way, yes, Sorg replied. But don't mistake their diplomacy for weakness. Humans thrive in chaos. They've turned war into a science, an art, and a game all at once. And when the galaxy pushes them too far, they push back with everything they've got. The scholar was silent, her mind reeling with questions. One thing was clear, humanity was a paradox, a species both terrifying and fascinating. Tell me, Krina asked after a long pause, what do you think they fear? Sorg chuckled darkly. Fear? Humans? Oh, they fear plenty, failure, loss, stagnation. But the thing that scares them most? He leaned closer, his voice low. Becoming like us, complacent, predictable. That's why they keep pushing themselves, always looking for the next challenge. Krina's gaze drifted to a group of humans at the far end of the bar, laughing and sharing stories. They looked so unassuming, so ordinary. Yet beneath their smiles lay a species capable of unimaginable feats. She turned back to Sorg. And do you think we'll ever understand them? Sorg drained his glass, a bitter smile on his face. Understand them? No. But we'll learn to respect them. Because when it comes to humans, you don't have a choice. A dance of chaos and precision. Krina couldn't shake the weight of Sorg's words as she wandered the bustling corridors of the trade station. The humans she passed appeared ordinary, smiling, conversing, completely unaware of the scholars' growing fascination with their kind. When she returned to the bar the next day, Sorg was waiting, another drink in hand. "You came back," he said, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "I need to know more," Krina admitted. "Tell me about their strategies, their tactics. How do they balance chaos with precision?" Sorg leaned back, his compound eyes glinting in the dim light. "Ah, the dance of chaos and precision. You've just described humans perfectly. They don't just balance it, they embrace it." He gestured with his drink. "The humans have a saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. It's how they approach everything. They plan meticulously but adapt instinctively. During the Battle of Vale's Edge, our fleets engaged them in what we thought was a decisive strike. We had blockaded their supply lines, crippled their communications, and forced their forces into retreat." Krina's antennae twitched. "It sounds like a victory." "That's what we thought," Sorg said, his voice heavy with irony. "But humans don't retreat the way other species do. It wasn't a retreat, it was a feint. They led us into the Vale Nebula, a region filled with volatile gas clouds. Our sensors were useless, and our ship struggled to navigate the gravitational anomalies. Meanwhile, the humans..." He paused, shaking his head in disbelief. "What did they do?" Krina prompted. "They detonated the gas clouds," Sorg said simply. "They lured us in, then turned the environment itself into a weapon. Our ships were torn apart by chain reactions. And the ones that survived? They were picked off by human strike teams operating from makeshift bases on asteroids." Krina's eyes widened. "They turned the battlefield into a trap." Sorg nodded. "Exactly. Humans don't fight on your terms. They make you fight on theirs. And when you think you've outsmarted them, they pull another trick out of their seemingly endless bag." "But surely that level of improvisation leads to mistakes," Krina argued. "It does," Sorg admitted. "Humans make mistakes all the time. But here's the thing, they don't let those mistakes stop them. During the Scaros conflict, they deployed a new type of drone equipped with experimental AI. The drones malfunctioned mid-battle, turning on their own fleet. You'd think that would spell disaster, right?" "Of course," Krina agreed. Sorg clicked his mandibles. "Not for humans. They adapted in real time, overriding the drone systems with manual controls. Pilots, actual living beings, took over remotely, guiding the drones to complete their mission. It was messy, inefficient, and completely insane. But it worked." Krina's mind raced. "So they thrive on chaos. But what about precision? You said they balance both." Sorg's eyes darkened. "Precision is where their ingenuity shines. Humans have a knack for finding weak points, physical, psychological, or even cultural. During the siege of Eurythus Prime, they discovered that our command structure relied heavily on a single neural hub. Instead of targeting our fleet, they launched a surgical strike on the hub. One precise hit, and our entire chain of command collapsed. They didn't need to win a prolonged battle, they won in seconds." Krina's antennae drooped in disbelief. "How can a species so chaotic achieve such precision?" "Because they understand something most species don't," Sorg said. "Chaos and precision aren't opposites, they're partners. Humans use chaos to create opportunities, then strike with precision when the moment is right. It's not just a tactic, it's their way of life." The scholar was silent, processing the enormity of what she had learned. Finally, she asked, "Do they ever stop? Ever let their guard down?" Sorg laughed, a harsh, chittering sound. "Stop? Never. Humans are always looking for the next challenge, the next innovation. Even in times of peace, they prepare for war. They train, they invent, they explore new ways to push their limits. And when the galaxy underestimates them. He gestured expansively. Well, you've seen what happens. Krina couldn't help but feel a chill. The more she learned about humans, the more she realized they weren't just warriors, they were survivors, innovators, and problem solvers. A species that thrived in adversity and turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. So, Sorg said, breaking the silence. Do you still think we lost because of their technology? Their numbers? Krina shook her head slowly. No. We lost because we were playing a game they'd mastered long before we even understood the rules. Sorg grinned, his mandibles clicking in satisfaction. Exactly. And that's why every species in the galaxy will think twice before crossing them again. Masters of resilience. Krina returned to the bar the following evening, her mind still reeling from Sorg's stories. She found him in his usual corner, drink in hand, staring out into the cosmos through the large viewport. The scholar slid into the seat across from him, determined to uncover more. You mentioned their adaptability and strategy, Krina began. But I keep wondering, what drives them? How can a species endure so much and keep fighting? Sorg glanced at her, his compound eyes narrowing. You want to know their secret? Their real strength? It's not their weapons or tactics. It's their resilience. Humans don't break like other species. They bend, adapt, and come back stronger. He took a long sip of his drink, the liquid reflecting the dim bar lights. Let me tell you about the Battle of Vraxis Outpost. We launched a surprise attack, completely overwhelming their defenses. Their colony was in ruins within hours, homes destroyed, supplies burned, survivors scattered. It should have been the end of them. Krina's antennae twitched. But it wasn't? No, Sorg said, shaking his head. It wasn't. The survivors retreated into the mountains, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever scraps they could salvage. We thought they'd starve, freeze, or turn on each other. Instead, they built a fortress. In less than a month, they constructed a stronghold out of nothing, stone, wood, even salvaged metal from our own wrecked equipment. He leaned forward, his mandibles clicking with emphasis. And when we came back to finish the job, they were ready. Their makeshift weapons outclassed our advanced tech in those tight mountain passes. They knew every crevice, every ambush point. We couldn't dislodge them. They turned a disaster into an advantage, Krina said, her voice filled with awe. Exactly, Sorg replied. Humans don't just endure hardship, they thrive in it. Their resilience isn't just physical, it's mental, emotional, even cultural. They have a saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And they mean it. Krina tilted her head. But surely, resilience has its limits. They must break eventually. Sorg chuckled darkly. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But humans have a way of defying limits. During the siege of Altrian, we bombarded their cities for weeks, relentless and unforgiving. We expected them to surrender. Instead, they kept fighting, even as their resources dwindled. He paused, his eyes distant. I remember capturing one of their soldiers, a young woman, barely an adult by their standards. She was wounded, starving, and exhausted. But when we interrogated her, she just smiled. Do you know what she said? Krina shook her head, her antennae quivering in anticipation. She said, "You're only making us angrier." The scholar blinked, stunned. Angrier? Sorg nodded. Humans don't crumble under pressure, they transform. Adversity fuels them. The harder you push them, the more determined they become. And it's not just their soldiers. Their civilians are just as resilient. During that same siege, they turned underground transit tunnels into living spaces. They built hydroponic farms in the ruins of their cities. They even managed to transmit propaganda through makeshift radio networks, keeping morale high despite everything. Krina was silent for a moment, digesting this. So their strength comes from their ability to endure and adapt, no matter the circumstances. It's more than that, Sorg said. It's their refusal to give up. Humans have an almost pathological need to keep going, to find solutions, to overcome whatever stands in their way. And when they fall, they don't just get back up, they learn. They come back with new strategies, new technologies, and an even stronger resolve. The scholar's gaze drifted to a nearby group of humans, laughing and sharing stories. She found it hard to reconcile their seemingly carefree nature with the terrifying warriors Sorg described. And yet, they don't seem burdened by it. How do they keep their spirit alive through so much hardship? Sorg gestured toward the humans. That's another part of their resilience. They find strength in their connections, in their families, their communities, their shared stories. They celebrate victories, mourn losses, and keep moving forward. And when things get tough, they turn to their humor, their art, their music. It's how they remind themselves what they're fighting for. Krina's antennae twitched thoughtfully. They fight for each other. Sorg nodded. Exactly. That's what makes them so dangerous. They don't fight for conquest or glory. They fight to protect, to survive, to ensure a future for their own. And when they're backed into a corner, they'll fight with everything they have, mind, body, and soul. The scholar sat back, her thoughts swirling. Humans weren't just warriors, they were survivors, creators, and builders. A species that turned every challenge into an opportunity, every failure into a lesson. You're starting to understand, Sorg said, his tone almost approving. But trust me, there's still more to learn about the Terrans. They're full of surprises, and they're not done proving themselves to the galaxy. Krina nodded, a spark of curiosity igniting in her chest. Then tell me more. I want to know everything. The edge of human ingenuity. Krina returned yet again to the dimly lit bar, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts about humanity. Sorg was already seated in his usual spot, a new drink in hand. The veteran seemed less guarded tonight, as though sharing these stories had lightened a burden he had carried for years. Back again? He asked, his mandibles clicking in faint amusement. I need to know more, Krina said firmly. You've told me about their resilience and creativity, but what about their ingenuity? What makes them so boundless? Sorg leaned back, his compound eyes glinting. Ingenuity, huh? That's the part that really gets under your exoskeleton, isn't it? The way they come up with solutions no one else would dare consider. He swirled his drink thoughtfully. Alright, let me tell you about the Battle of Helios Drift. That's where we learn just how far humans will go when faced with impossible odds. We'd surrounded their fleet, cut off every possible escape route. Our ships were faster, better armed, and equipped with advanced cloaking systems. There was no way out. Krina leaned forward, captivated. What did they do? They turned the battlefield into their ally, Sorg said, his voice tinged with both respect and disbelief. Helios Drift is a region filled with massive asteroid clusters and gravity wells. Dangerous, unpredictable, and completely inhospitable to sustained combat. We assumed no one would be reckless enough to fight there. But the humans were, Krina guessed. Sorg nodded. Not only did they fight, but they made the terrain their greatest weapon. They rigged the asteroids with makeshift propulsion systems, turning them into mobile hazards. Then they used their ships as bait, drawing our fleet into the chaos. We couldn't fire without risking collisions. Meanwhile, they maneuvered with pinpoint precision, weaving through the debris like it was a dance. That's impossible, Krina said, her antennae twitching in disbelief. It should have been, Sorg admitted. But humans thrive in the impossible. They don't just solve problems, they redefine them. And it's not just in battle. Their ingenuity extends to every aspect of their lives. When faced with a challenge, they don't see limits, they see possibilities. Krina tilted her head. How do they come up with such unconventional ideas? Sorg chuckled. It's in their nature. Humans don't have the same rigid hierarchies or traditions as most species. They question everything, experiment constantly, and aren't afraid to fail. During the siege of Cryo Station, for instance, their supply lines were cut off. Instead of surrendering, they created oxygen farms out of algae and recycled their waste into fuel. They turned a losing situation into a self-sustaining ecosystem. Improvise, adapt, overcome, Krina murmured, recalling an old human phrase she had come across in her studies. Exactly, Sorg said, pointing at her. They're relentless innovators. While we were busy perfecting technology for specific purposes, they were creating multipurpose tools. One of their soldiers captured during the Talvon conflict had a device called a Swiss Army knife. A single object that could cut, pierce, grip, and more. It was primitive, but brilliant in its versatility. Krina frowned. But ingenuity without discipline can lead to recklessness. How do they balance it? That's the beauty of it, Sorg said. Humans have a way of blending chaos with structure. They innovate wildly, but they also know when to focus. During the final days of the Arcturus campaign, their fleet was heavily outgunned. So they didn't fight conventionally. Instead, they developed a new weapon in the middle of the battle, a fusion of their existing technology and captured alien tech. They called it a disruption cannon. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to turn the tide. Krina's antennae quivered. They invented a weapon during the battle? Yes, Sorg said with a bitter laugh. And that's what makes them so terrifying. They don't wait for the perfect moment or the ideal conditions. They act, they create, and they adapt, all in real time. The scholar's gaze drifted to the humans across the bar, their laughter and camaraderie filling the air. And yet, they don't seem to take themselves seriously. How can a species so ingenious be so carefree? That's another part of their brilliance, Sorg said. Humor and creativity go hand in hand. Humans find joy in the absurd, the unexpected. It's how they cope, how they bond, and how they innovate. During the Skarn offensive, they used balloons, yes, balloons, to create decoy ships. It was absurd, but it worked. Our scanners couldn't differentiate between the real targets and the decoys, and we wasted valuable resources attacking hot air. Krina shook her head in amazement. They find solutions in the strangest places. Always, Sorg agreed. And that's why you can never truly predict them. Their ingenuity isn't just about technology, it's a mindset, a way of life. They approach every challenge with the belief that there's a way to overcome it, no matter how impossible it seems. The scholar sat back, her mind buzzing with newfound understanding. Humans weren't just warriors or survivors, they were creators, dreamers, and problem solvers. A species that refused to be constrained by limitations. They're not just fighting battles, Krina said softly. They're rewriting the rules of the galaxy. Sorg grinned, his mandibles clicking in approval. Now you're starting to get it. And trust me, the more you learn about humans, the more you'll realize how much we underestimated them. The unyielding spirit of humanity. Krina arrived at the bar earlier than usual, eager to hear more. Sorg was already seated, his drink untouched for once. The veteran seemed deep in thought, his compound eyes fixed on the vast expanse of stars visible through the station's viewport. You're eager today, Sorg said, his tone softer than usual as Krina slid into the seat across from him. Your stories have been enlightening, Krina admitted. But I still don't fully understand. You've told me about their resilience, their ingenuity, their creativity. But what truly drives them? What makes them unyielding? Sorg sighed, leaning back in his chair. It's not an easy thing to explain, but if you're ready to hear it, I'll tell you about the battle that taught me what makes humans unstoppable. The Battle of Orus 9. Krina's antennae perked up. I've read about that battle. It was supposed to be the end of the Terran resistance, wasn't it? Supposed to be, Sorg echoed bitterly. We threw everything we had at them. Their cities were bombed to rubble, their supply chains severed. Our forces were advancing on all fronts. By every calculation, they were finished. But they weren't, Krina said, leaning forward. Sorg nodded. They weren't. When we reached the capital, expecting to find demoralized survivors begging for mercy, we found a wall. A literal wall, hastily constructed out of debris, concrete, steel, even wrecked vehicles. Behind it were humans armed with whatever they could find, guns, blades, improvised explosives. And in front of the wall. He paused, his mandibles clicking in agitation. What was in front of the wall? Krina asked, her voice barely a whisper. Children, Sorg said grimly. Not armed, not fighting. Just standing there, holding banners with messages scrawled in their language. They weren't shields, they were a message. We're still here, those banners said. We won't give up. Krina's eyes widened in disbelief. They put their children in harm's way? No, Sorg corrected sharply. They trusted us not to harm them. And they were right. Even we couldn't bring ourselves to attack them directly. It bought their soldiers enough time to regroup and launch a counteroffensive. They didn't just fight back, they drove us out of the capital entirely. Humans don't just resist, they inspire resistance. The scholar was silent for a long moment, struggling to process the weight of his words. Finally, she said, so their strength comes from their will. Their refusal to surrender, even in the face of annihilation. It's more than that, Sorg said. Their will isn't just stubbornness, it's hope. Humans have this uncanny ability to find hope in the darkest of times. During the Orus 9 campaign, we intercepted their communications. Their soldiers were writing letters to their families, not about fear or despair, but about rebuilding, about the future. Even when everything was falling apart, they believed they would win. Krina tilted her head. But where does that hope come from? How can a species so fragile hold on to it so tightly? It comes from their stories, Sorg said. Their history is filled with tales of triumph over impossible odds. They've faced extinction before, natural disasters, wars, pandemics, and they've survived every time. It's ingrained in them, this belief that no matter how dire the situation, there's always a way forward. The veteran's gaze drifted to the humans gathered at the far end of the bar, laughing and sharing drinks. They celebrate life, even in the midst of chaos. It's what keeps them going. They don't just fight for survival, they fight for each other, for the lives they've built, for the hope of something better. Krina's mind raced with newfound understanding. Humans weren't just resilient or ingenious, they were driven by something deeper, something unquantifiable. You said earlier that you survived them, she said softly. But it sounds like you also respect them. Sorg chuckled, his mandibles clicking softly. Respect? That doesn't even begin to cover it. I admire them. They taught me that strength isn't just about power or technology, it's about spirit. And humans have the strongest spirit I've ever encountered. Krina's antennae twitched thoughtfully. And yet, they're still seen as dangerous, even reckless. How do you reconcile that with their hope and creativity? Sorg leaned forward, his compound eyes glinting. Because their hope doesn't make them less dangerous. If anything, it makes them more so. A species that refuses to surrender, that adapts to every challenge, that fights not out of hatred but out of love for what they hold dear, that's a species you don't want to cross. The scholar sat back, the weight of his words settling over her. Humanity wasn't just a force to be reckoned with, they were a force of nature, a testament to the unyielding power of the spirit. They're not just warriors, Krina said finally. They're dreamers, builders, survivors. They're everything the galaxy fears and admires. Sorg smiled faintly, raising his glass. To the humans, he said. The most terrifying, incredible species in the galaxy. Krina hesitated, then raised her own glass in return. To the humans, she echoed. Humanity's greatest weapon. The bar was quieter than usual when Krina returned. Sorg sat alone, staring into his drink, the faint hum of the station filling the silence. As Krina approached, he looked up, his compound eyes glinting with a strange mixture of weariness and reverence. You're here for the final lesson, aren't you? Sorg asked, his voice tinged with resignation. Yes, Krina replied, sitting across from him. You've told me about their resilience, their creativity, their adaptability. But I need to know, what is humanity's greatest weapon? What makes them truly unmatched? Sorg exhaled deeply, leaning forward. Their greatest weapon isn't what you think. It's not their technology, their strategy, or even their will to survive. It's something much more dangerous. Krina's antennae twitched. What is it? Their ability to unite, Sorg said, his voice low and deliberate. When humanity is divided, they're formidable. But when they come together, they're unstoppable. The scholar frowned, unsure. But aren't all species capable of unity? Sorg shook his head. Not like humans. Most species unite out of necessity, temporary alliances to face a common threat. But humans, they forge bonds that transcend logic, alliances that defy reason. They don't just fight for themselves, they fight for each other, for their allies, even for strangers. During the Tarsus Accord conflict, we witnessed this firsthand. What happened? Krina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We had cornered a coalition of human and alien forces on a barren moon, Sorg began. The alien forces were ready to surrender, they were outnumbered, starving, hopeless. But the humans refused to abandon them. They shared their rations, patched their wounds, and bolstered their morale with stories of Earth's history, of great battles, of survival against the odds. And then? Then they fought like demons, Sorg said, his mandibles clicking in agitation. The humans led the charge, drawing our fire, sacrificing themselves to protect their allies. They turned a fragmented, defeated coalition into a unified force. And they won. Not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they inspired everyone around them to fight harder, to believe in victory. Krina's antennae quivered. They inspire unity in others? Exactly, Sorg said. It's their most terrifying trait. Humans have this, magnetism, this ability to bring out the best in those who fight alongside them. They don't just lead, they uplift. They make you believe that the impossible is within reach. And once they've united a group, they become a force no one can withstand. The scholar's gaze drifted to the humans in the bar, their laughter and camaraderie filling the air. So their strength doesn't just come from themselves, it comes from those they inspire. Sorg nodded. That's what makes them so dangerous. It's not just their resilience or their ingenuity. It's their capacity to bring others into their fight, to forge alliances that shouldn't exist, to turn enemies into allies. Krina was silent, the weight of his words settling over her. But what drives them to do this? Why do they unite so fiercely? Hope, Sorg said simply. Humans are driven by an unshakable belief in a better future. They don't just fight for survival, they fight for the possibility of something greater. And that hope is infectious. It spreads to everyone around them, turning despair into determination. The scholar tilted her head thoughtfully. So, in the end, humanity's greatest weapon is their ability to believe. Sorg smiled faintly. Yes. Belief in themselves, in each other, in the idea that no matter how dark the galaxy becomes, there's always a way forward. And that belief makes them unstoppable. The two sat in silence for a long moment, the hum of the station filling the air. Finally, Krina spoke. "They're more than warriors, more than survivors," she said softly. "They're a beacon of hope." Sorg nodded. "And that's why we lost. Not because of their weapons or their tactics, but because they made us believe, too. By the end of the war, even we couldn't deny their spirit. They don't just fight battles, they change the galaxy." Krina stood, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. "Thank you, Sorg. You've given me more than I expected." The veteran grinned, raising his glass. "To humanity," he said. Krina raised her own glass in return. "To humanity." As she walked away, Krina realized she wasn't just leaving with a story, she was leaving with a new understanding of what it meant to face humanity. They weren't just a species, they were a force, an idea, a hope that burned brighter than any star.